Picture the stone walls of Pembroke Castle in the dead of winter, 1457. The air outside howls with Atlantic winds, carrying salt spray from the sea and rattling through the narrow arrow slits of the fortress. Inside, torches sputter, shadows stretch, and the cries of a girl echo with a terror that chills every listener to the bone. 13-year-old Margaret Beaufort clutches at the sodden bed linens, her small body convulsing in pain that no child should ever know. She is too young, too narrow in hip, too fragile in form. Yet here she labors to bring forth a son, one who will someday be crowned as Henry VII, the first Tudor King of England. The midwives move in silence, their faces grim, their hands busy, with bloodied cloths and herbs meant to soothe. They whisper half-remembered prayers to the Virgin and to Saint Margaret of Antioch, patroness of women in labor. The chamber reeks of smoke and sweat, lavender and iron, life and death intertwined. Outside, the castle stands immovable on its limestone rock above the sea, a reminder of endurance. Inside, it feels as though time itself pauses, waiting to see if mother or child will emerge from this struggle alive. Margaret is scarcely more than a child herself. Her hair clings damp to her temples, her lips are cracked, and her eyes, once bright with the innocence of girlhood, are glazed with agony. Each contraction rips through her like fire, leaving her gasping. The women attending her, hardened by years of births, exchange heavy glances. They have seen this before, a girl pressed into womanhood too soon, her body unprepared for the brutal demands of childbirth. Few such stories end well. Jasper Tudor, Margaret's brother-in-law and her reluctant protector, paces the stone corridor outside. He hears every muffled cry, each one stabbing at his conscience. He knows this girl's survival is no longer a private matter. It is tied to dynasties, to the survival of the Lancastrian cause itself. For Margaret carries the last fragile hope of a house already losing the Wars of the Roses. If she dies, if the child dies, Lancaster's bloodline withers. Hours stretch into eternity. The midwives argue in whispers. Should they attempt to turn the baby? Should they intervene with blades and hooks, instruments that too often kill rather than save? The physician, summoned from his uneasy rest, shakes his head. He has studied at Oxford, read Galen and Hippocrates, but in this chamber he feels as helpless as any peasant before the mystery of birth. He knows the truth. Margaret's body is too young, her bones not yet shaped for this passage. But to wait is to risk death for both. The chamber fills with smoke from burning rosemary, believed to drive away evil spirits, and with the acrid tang of sweat. Margaret bites down on a strip of leather to keep from screaming, but her voice soon breaks through, raw and primal, filling the keep with echoes of mortal suffering. The servants cross themselves when they hear it. Some whisper that it sounds less like the cry of a girl and more like the birth pangs of England's fate itself. At last, after a night that feels longer than any winter, the silence shatters. A cry, thin, wavering at first, then stronger, fills the air. An infant's voice, defiant, insistent. Henry Tudor has been born. Margaret, her body broken and bleeding, half-conscious and barely breathing, hears it through the haze. She tries to lift her arms toward the child, but her strength fails her. For a brief moment, the midwives lay the boy on her chest, his tiny heartbeat thudding against hers. She memorizes his face in that instant, even as darkness pulls at the edge of her vision. The midwives work frantically to staunch Margaret's bleeding. They know she will never bear another child. Her body has been torn beyond repair. Yet, miraculously, she clings to life. The girl mother and her son both survive. In that bleak chamber, amid blood and prayer and the rasp of the winter wind, a dynasty is born. No one present could know the scale of what had just been set into motion. This frail boy, born of agony and desperation, would grow to end decades of civil war. He would marry the daughter of his family's greatest enemy, uniting York and Lancaster at last. From his line would spring Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, names that would echo across the world. But in this moment, all of that lies hidden in the cries of a newborn and the gasping breaths of a girl who has given everything. For Margaret Beaufort, The pain of that night would never truly leave her. It would shape her faith, her ambition, and her unyielding will. She would walk forever in the shadow of that chamber, knowing that her survival had been bought at a terrible price, and she would never forget that her body had been shattered so that England might gain a king. Long before the agony of that Pembroke night, Margaret Beaufort entered the world already marked by both privilege and peril. She was born around May 1443 at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire, a quiet place of orchards and gardens that belied the storm gathering over England. To the outside world, she was merely another noble child, but within her veins flowed a dangerous inheritance, the blood of kings. She was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III, and through that descent, she carried the claims of the Lancastrian line. In 15th century England, such blood was never a simple blessing. It was a brand, visible to all, that declared its bearer a potential pawn or a dangerous rival. In Margaret's lifetime, the Wars of the Roses would transform noble children like her into weapons for dynasties. To be born Beaufort was to be born into the shadow of crowns, and crowns in that age were soaked in blood. Her father, John Beaufort, the first Duke of Somerset, embodied both the pride and the curse of her heritage. Once entrusted with command in France during the waning years of the 100 Years' War, he returned home defeated and disgraced. English fortunes overseas crumbled like sand slipping through fingers, and men whispered that his incompetence, or, worse, his despair, had hastened the collapse. In a world where honor was currency, Beaufort was bankrupt. When Margaret was barely more than a toddler, the family's fortunes darkened further. On May 27, 1444, John Beaufort was found dead at Wimborne Minster. The official record spoke blandly of fever, but few believed it. Courtiers whispered of suicide, a nobleman undone by shame. Others muttered of poison, for in those years the specter of poisoning haunted every sudden noble death, like shadows lurking behind the arras. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Margaret's father was gone, his legacy stained, and his infant daughter left vulnerable in a court where wolves circled at the scent of weakness. For Margaret's mother, Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe, survival demanded quick calculation. She was now a widow with a child whose blood was both valuable and dangerous. In the brutal arithmetic of noble politics, a girl could be leveraged only through marriage. By the time Margaret was 6, her hand had already been promised to John de la Pole, the son of William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. The betrothal was a political contract, nothing more. The two children may have shared toys in the gardens of Bletsoe, but their union was meant to bind two powerful houses into alliance. But alliances were fragile, and so were men's fortunes. In 1450, Suffolk was murdered while crossing the English Channel, dragged from his ship and butchered with a rusty sword in a grotesque parody of justice. His crime had been brokering the marriage between King Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, a deal that ceded Maine and Anjou to France and enraged the English nobility. His enemies claimed the sea itself demanded his life. In truth, it was English fury that had ended him. With Suffolk's fall, Margaret's betrothal vanished like parchment in fire. The little girl at Bletsoe was learning early that her destiny would not be her own. One moment promised as the bride of a duke's heir, the next discarded as though her life were a contract to be voided. To Margaret's mother, this was not defeat. It was instruction. She understood that her daughter's survival would depend upon adaptability, quick marriages, and the ability to transform disaster into opportunity. From childhood, Margaret grew under this maternal tutelage, absorbing lessons that would serve her in the decades ahead. She learned that noble women were not powerless, but their power was subtle, veiled, and easily overlooked. It lived in contracts, alliances, and the unyielding will to endure. She learned, too, that her Beaufort bloodline was both armor and target. The Beauforts themselves were a family born of compromise and shadow. They were descended from the children of John of Gaunt and his mistress, Catherine Swynford, later legitimized by royal decree. Yet the stain of illegitimacy clung to them, whispered about in corners of court and on the battlefield banners of their enemies. Margaret would hear those whispers all her life, that she was descended from bastardy, that her claim was fragile, and yet, In the vacuum left by dead princes and broken kings, that fragile claim would someday be enough to place her son on the throne. But in her earliest years, Margaret could not yet grasp such destiny. She was a child wandering castle gardens, kneeling at chapel pews and overhearing the anxious murmurings of adults who saw in her both promise and danger. Yet even as a child, she displayed a solemnity beyond her age. Chroniclers note her piety, her quiet seriousness, as though she instinctively understood that her life would be lived under relentless scrutiny. It was said by some that Margaret was born old, a girl who carried the weight of history in her small hands. Whether true or not, the circumstances of her birth and her father's fall ensured that her childhood was brief, her innocence fleeting. Already the pieces of her life were being moved across the chessboard of English politics. And, soon, she would be placed in a marriage that would propel her into the heart of a dynastic struggle destined to consume her country. By the age of 6, Margaret Beaufort had already discovered that her life was not her own. She was a Beaufort, and that meant she was a tool to be used, a thread in the vast tapestry of dynastic politics. In 15th century England, girls of noble blood were rarely daughters in the modern sense. They were promises, contracts, alliances yet to be sealed. Their worth was calculated not by childhood charm, but by whose bed they might one day share, whose lineage they might strengthen. Her first betrothal had bound her to John de la Pole, son of William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. To outsiders, it seemed an alliance that would secure her place among the foremost families of the realm. But in England's violent and shifting politics, permanence was a fragile dream. The Duke of Suffolk fell from favor in a storm of public outrage over his negotiation of Henry VI's marriage to Margaret of Anjou and the humiliating surrender of Maine and Anjou to France. In 1450, Suffolk's enemies struck. The manner of his death was infamous. Captured at sea while attempting to cross the Channel, Suffolk was dragged from his ship and executed in grotesque fashion. A rusty sword hacked at his neck in clumsy strokes, 6 blows required to sever his head. His body was tossed upon the sand, his severed head mounted on a pole. England had made an example of him, and with his death, young Margaret's engagement evaporated like smoke in wind. For the Beaufort women, this was no cause for mourning, it was a lesson. Margaret's mother, Margaret Beauchamp, understood that her daughter must adapt to survive. In the game of alliances, one broken contract was no catastrophe. There would always be another suitor, another opportunity to strengthen their family's standing. The next match came swiftly and with far more consequence. Margaret, scarcely 12 years old, was promised to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. The match was orchestrated not for affection, but for politics. Edmund was the half-brother of King Henry VI, the son of Queen Catherine of Valois by her second husband, Owen Tudor. The Tudors were Welsh upstarts, men of modest origin elevated by royal favor. Yet through Catherine, they carried a tenuous link to the Lancastrian crown. The Tudors themselves embodied England's uneasy mingling of love and ambition. Catherine of Valois, widow of the great warrior King Henry V, had scandalized the nobility by secretly marrying Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier of no great standing. Their union was a reminder that even queens could fall prey to forbidden passion, and the children it produced, Edmund and Jasper, were tainted by both legitimacy and scandal. Henry VI, however, had recognized his half-brothers, showered them with titles and bound them to the Lancastrian cause. To marry Margaret Beaufort to Edmund Tudor was no accident. It was the fusion of 2 fragile but vital bloodlines, the Beauforts, with their claim from John of Gaunt, and the Tudors, with their direct royal kinship through Catherine of Valois. It was a union designed to secure the future of the Lancastrian dynasty, or at least to create heirs who might serve as rallying points in a realm already trembling toward civil war. The marriage contract was signed in 1455, when Margaret was only 12. That same year, England erupted into open conflict at St. Albans, the first clash of the Wars of the Roses. The White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster had drawn swords, and the realm would not know peace again for decades. Margaret, though a child, had been thrust onto the front line of this dynastic war, not with weapons, but with her body, her womb, her capacity to produce heirs. The ceremony itself, held at Bletsoe Castle, was steeped in ritual. Tapestries depicting the Beaufort ancestry hung in the hall, and the chapel where vows were spoken contained the tombs of Margaret's forebears. Edmund, a man in his mid-20s, stood tall, hardened by politics and battle. Margaret, still, childlike in face and form, scarcely understood the vows she was made to utter. Yet once spoken, those words bound her to a destiny that reached far beyond her imagination. There was no waiting, no pause for her body to catch up with her fate. The marriage was consummated immediately, as law and custom demanded. For Margaret, the experience was shattering. Later, she would never speak of that night, but the consequences would be written into her flesh forever. She was barely a woman, yet she was forced to become one before her time. For Edmund Tudor, the marriage was victory. For Margaret, it was survival. But it was also the end of her childhood. That night, the girl of Bletsoe Castle became a political pawn of the highest stakes, a child bride whose womb carried the fragile hopes of a dynasty, and within a year, her life would darken still further. The year was 1455. England was sliding into chaos, and Margaret Beaufort, just 12 years old, was being escorted to her wedding. The girl who had once played among the gardens of Bletsoe now stood at the threshold of a destiny she could not yet grasp. Her groom, Edmund Tudor, was in his mid-20s, a seasoned courtier and soldier, half-brother to King Henry VI, and already burdened with the weight of politics. The ceremony took place at Bletsoe Castle, where the Beauforts displayed their lineage proudly. Tapestries hung from the stone walls, embroidered with the crests of noble ancestors. The air was heavy with incense, Latin prayers echoing in the chapel where centuries of Beaufort bones rested beneath the floor. The vows spoken that day were not vows of love. They were chains of obligation, binding child to man, family to dynasty. To understand the weight of this marriage, one must look to Edmund's family, the Tudors. They were not of ancient nobility. Their father, Owen Tudor, had been a Welsh courtier of modest standing, perhaps even a servant, who captured the heart of Catherine of Valois, widow of King Henry V. Their union had been secret, even scandalous, but it produced sons whom King Henry VI acknowledged as his half-brothers. Through Catherine, Edmund and Jasper Tudor carried royal blood, though many sneered at the Welsh upstarts who dared to mingle their line with that of kings. It was a bold gamble to wed Margaret Beaufort to Edmund Tudor. Her blood carried legitimacy. Through John of Gaunt and Edward III, his carried proximity to the throne through Catherine of Valois. Together they might create an heir who would fuse two fragile claims into something formidable. But in that gamble, Margaret was not a partner. She was the stake itself. The consummation of the marriage happened without delay. In that age, there was no concept of waiting for a girl's body to mature. Noble daughters were bred for alliances and heirs, their own suffering considered a minor price for dynastic gain. For Margaret, the experience was nothing less than a violation of her youth. History offers no direct words from her on the matter, but her later life, her intense religiosity, her devotion to the Virgin Mary, her vow of chastity after Henry's birth, speaks volumes about the trauma that followed. Edmund, for his part, was no monster. He acted as custom dictated, securing his family's future and obeying the expectations of his station. Yet the gulf between them, his worldliness and her childhood, was unbridgeable. Margaret's body, still unfinished in its growth, bore the consequences of this union. Within months, she was with child. The court rejoiced. A Beaufort Tudor heir would strengthen Lancaster's cause in the storm of war. But those who looked closer, the older women who attended Margaret, saw the danger. Her hips were too narrow, her frame too slight. Pregnancy at 13 was a perilous venture. Yet no, one suggested otherwise. In Margaret's world, the survival of dynasties outweighed the survival of girls. In the autumn of 1456, while Margaret endured her swelling belly and the gnawing fears of childbirth, disaster struck again. Edmund Tudor, leading Lancastrian forces in Wales, was captured by Yorkist soldiers. Taken to Carmarthen Castle, he fell into enemy hands. The records are murky, but by November, he was dead. Some claimed plague carried him off in the prison's foul air. Others whispered murder, for a Tudor half-brother of the king was no small prize in the game of power. Thus, at 13, Margaret was widowed and pregnant, her husband's body left behind in captivity. She had no protector, but Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, who swiftly claimed responsibility for her welfare. Jasper was young himself, barely in his mid-20s, but he recognized that Margaret's womb carried not just his brother's child, but the future of their entire line. He brought her to Pembroke Castle, a fortress rising above the sea, battered by winds and salt spray. It was no gentle refuge. Its halls were cold, its stones ancient, its air sharp with the scent of tide and smoke. Yet within those walls, Margaret would face the greatest ordeal of her life. As winter deepened, and her belly grew heavy, whispers swirled among those who cared for her. Could she survive the trial ahead? Many doubted. But Margaret had already shown the resolve of one who understood, even at 13, that her suffering was part of a larger design. In her prayers, she spoke not only for herself, but for the child, who must live. And so, in the storm-lashed January of 1457, the child bride prepared for the birth that would nearly end her life and change the destiny of England. By the winter of 1456, Margaret Beaufort was no longer merely a child bride. She was a widow, her husband Edmund Tudor dead within a year of their union. At 13, her body swelled with pregnancy, her future bound to a child not yet born, and her fate cast adrift in a realm on the brink of civil war. The news of Edmund's death arrived at Lampthe Palace, where Margaret had been living while he campaigned in Wales. A messenger rode through the rain to deliver the tidings. The Earl of Richmond was gone, felled either by plague or by enemy malice. Chroniclers offered no certainty, only suspicion. Some wrote that disease consumed him in the filthy cells of Carmarthen Castle. Others hinted that his Yorkist captors found a quieter way to rid themselves of a Lancastrian half-brother. Whatever the truth, Edmund's sudden death left Margaret dangerously exposed. In medieval England, a woman without husband or powerful male kin was perilously vulnerable. Property, safety, even personal autonomy could vanish overnight. But Margaret was no ordinary widow. She carried in her womb the last hope of the Tudor line, a child who might one day stand as a standard for the Lancastrian cause. That fragile promise alone saved her from obscurity. It was Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, the Earl of Pembroke, who stepped into the void. At 25, he was scarcely older than Margaret herself, yet he bore the weight of a dynasty. Chivalry and pragmatism alike demanded his protection of his sister-in-law. Without hesitation, Jasper claimed responsibility for Margaret and the unborn child, ensuring her safety and the preservation of her late brother's legacy. He brought her to his fortress at Pembroke Castle. The journey itself was an ordeal. Winter roads were treacherous with mud and ice, rivers swollen with rain, and the ever-present danger of armed bands who roamed the countryside. Margaret, heavily pregnant and physically slight, traveled in a litter jolting over the rutted tracks. Every bump sent fresh pain through her body. Yet she endured, silent and pale, clinging to prayer beads and whispered psalms. Pembroke Castle loomed like a stone guardian above the Milford Haven estuary. Built on a limestone outcrop, it had withstood centuries of storms and sieges. Its round keep rose nearly 80 feet above the sea, a bulwark against both invader and fate. But within its gray walls the comfort was sparse. The winds off the Atlantic pierced through every crack, carrying salt and cold into chambers hung with heavy tapestries. Fires roared in the great hearths, but the warmth barely touched the drafts that whistled down the corridors. Here Margaret settled as much prisoner of her condition as guest of her guardian. Her pregnancy advanced, and with it came fear. The physician summoned to attend her, Dr. Lewis of Caerleon, learned in both Oxford and Paris, studied her small frame and shook his head in private. Her hips were too narrow, her body unfinished, still caught between childhood and womanhood. He confided to Jasper what he dared not tell the girl herself. The birth would be dangerous, perhaps fatal. The midwives, women seasoned by decades of experience, murmured their own worries. They had seen young brides forced into motherhood too early. Too often, mother and child were lost. Yet Margaret herself betrayed no outward fear. She prayed in the chapel for hours, her knees pressed raw against the stone, her lips moving ceaselessly, in whispered devotion. Some would later say her piety became an obsession that took root in these months, faith as shield, as salve, as meaning pressed upon suffering. As her body strained beneath the burden, Margaret's spirit sharpened. She began to listen more intently to Jasper, who spoke of war, politics, and loyalty. She absorbed lessons in survival, how to read men's faces, how to hear truth in silence, how to turn knowledge into power. In her child's body lived a mind quickening toward steel. Outside Pembroke's walls, the realm was collapsing further, into civil war. The First Battle of St. Albans had been fought the same year Margaret wed Edmund. Now England's nobles gathered armies under the banners of Lancaster and York, red rose against white, kin against kin. To most, it was the clash of dukes and kings. To Margaret, it was the world her son would be born into, a world where his blood would mark him for both survival and slaughter. As the days of her confinement lengthened, and the bitter January winds lashed Pembroke's keep, the household braced for the trial to come. Servants scurried with fresh linens, herbs, and relics of saints. Midwives sharpened knives meant not only for cords but for grim decisions in desperate hours. Fires burned day and night, and prayers rose like smoke to heaven. And Margaret, pale-faced and thin, waited. She was 13, a widow, a pawn in the game of kings. Yet within her, a child stirred, the last fragile thread of a dynasty. The ordeal of labor was near, and with it the chance to either extinguish or ignite the future of England. January 1457. The Atlantic winds clawed at Pembroke Castle, rattling shutters and whistling through arrow slits. Inside, in a chamber dimly lit by tallow candles, the air was thick with smoke from burning rosemary and lavender. It was the smell of ritual, of desperation, of women preparing for a battle that only they could fight. At the center of it all lay Margaret Beaufort, 13 years old, her body racked with waves of agony that came faster with each passing hour. The first contraction had struck as she walked the battlements, her hand pressed to her swollen belly, while the sea roared below. She had staggered, gasping, before her ladies-in-waiting rushed to bring her back to her bed. Since then, time had dissolved into endless cycles of pain. The midwives whispered urgently among themselves, their faces lined with grim knowledge. They had seen this before, a child struggling to bring forth another child. The odds were cruel. Margaret bit down on a strip of leather, her muffled cries still piercing the stone walls. Sweat slicked her pale skin, strands of hair plastered to her brow. Her body was too small, her pelvis too narrow, her strength already waning. Yet she fought on, hour after hour, clinging to life with a resolve that startled those around her. Jasper Tudor paced the corridor outside, his boots echoing on the flagstones. He could hear her voice through the oak door, sometimes a shriek, sometimes only a guttural moan. With each cry, he flinched. The future of Lancaster itself lay within that chamber, but for Jasper, the ordeal was more than politics. He had grown protective of Margaret, a girl forced too soon into a woman's suffering. Her survival mattered to him as much as her child's. Inside, the midwives worked with frantic devotion. Dame Gwen, the eldest among them, moved with the calm of one who had delivered hundreds of children. She rubbed oils into Margaret's skin, whispered prayers in Welsh and Latin, shifted the girl's body in desperate attempts to coax the baby into position. Around her, assistants fetched basins of hot water, tore strips of linen, and murmured invocations to saints. The physician, Dr. Lewis of Caerleon, hovered with an expression caught between knowledge and helplessness. He had studied the wisdom of Galen and Hippocrates, yet here in this chamber of blood and screams, those texts felt like empty words. Hours dragged into night, night into day. The fire in the hearth burned low, refueled again and again by exhausted servants. Margaret's voice grew hoarse until she could no longer scream, only gasp, low animal sounds that chilled the attendants' hearts. Her lips whispered fragments of prayer even as her body failed her. Ave Maria, ora pro nobis. The child would not come. Panic shadowed the women's eyes. Margaret was bleeding, her pulse faint, her skin white as linen. At last, Dame Gwen made her choice. With steady hands and whispered supplication to Saint Margaret of Antioch, she reached inside, guiding the infant through torn flesh and blood. It was a brutal act, one that risked the mother's life as much as it promised the child's. And then, a sound. Not Margaret's, but high and piercing. A newborn's cry, weak at first, then louder, filling the chamber with the raw defiance of survival. The women froze, then wept. Against every expectation, the child was alive. Margaret, barely conscious, turned her head. Through a haze of pain, she saw her son, small, red-faced, flailing. For an instant, he was laid upon her chest, his warmth pressing into her broken body. She tried to lift her arms, but could not. Still, her eyes fixed upon him, burning the memory of his face into her soul. The midwives carried the infant to the fire, swaddling him in cloth, rubbing his limbs until his wailing grew stronger. Margaret, fading in and out of awareness, heard his voice like a beacon. She knew, even in her weakness, that he must live, whatever it cost her. By dawn, the chamber reeked of sweat, blood, and smoke. Margaret lay shattered, her body forever altered by the ordeal. The physician knew what no one dared tell her. The injuries were permanent. She would never safely bear another child. Her womb had given England one heir, and in the process it had destroyed itself. The child she had fought to bring into the world was christened Henry Tudor, a frail infant, yet destined for greatness, and Margaret Beaufort, little more than a child herself, now bore the title of mother. Outside, the winds of January howled across the Welsh cliffs. The waves crashed endlessly against the rocks, indifferent to human pain. Yet within those castle walls, something extraordinary had taken place. From the near death of a girl had come the birth of a dynasty. For weeks after Henry Tudor's birth, Margaret Beaufort hovered on the edge of life and death. Fever burned through her, her body torn and bloodied from the ordeal. The midwives prayed, spoon-fed her broths, and bathed her brow with cold water. Dr. Lewis of Caerleon shook his head as he inspected her injuries. Her pelvis mangled, her womb permanently damaged, her strength so depleted that even sitting upright left her trembling. Few expected her to survive, and yet, slowly, miraculously, she did. But survival came at a terrible price. At 13, Margaret's childbearing years had effectively ended. The delivery had wrecked her body so thoroughly that she would never again bring another child into the world. For the rest of her life, she would live with pain, with weakness, and with the knowledge that her only son would be her only chance at legacy. It was a cruel irony. Her body sacrificed for dynastic ambition, yet that very sacrifice was what made her indispensable. The physical recovery was long and agonizing, but the deeper scars lay in her mind. The nights after the birth were filled with nightmares. Servants reported hearing her cry out in her sleep, reliving the agony of the birthing chamber. Loud noises startled her, touches made her flinch. Holding her newborn son brought joy but also terror. His tiny cries carried her back into the memory of her own screams. Trauma lingered in every gesture, a silent shadow that would never fully leave her. Yet from this wreckage, something remarkable took shape. Margaret turned her suffering into resolve. She withdrew into prayer, spending hours in Pembroke's chapel until her knees bled on the cold stone floors. She fasted, she memorized entire sections of scripture, and she whispered ceaseless prayers to the Virgin Mary. Some whispered that she had become obsessed, that her piety was unnatural in its intensity. But to Margaret, faith was no retreat. It was armor. If her body was frail, then her spirit would be forged in fire. It was in those fevered, prayer-soaked months that Margaret's character hardened. She came to see herself as chosen, not in the naive way of childhood, but in the steely conviction of someone who had suffered and endured. She believed her survival, and her son's, was no accident but the will of God. And if God had spared her, then her life must serve a greater purpose. That conviction would sustain her through decades of war, exile, and betrayal. Her son Henry, meanwhile, became the fragile center of her existence. He was the future, her future, Lancaster's future, perhaps even England's. Yet, cruelly, even he was kept at arm's length. Practicality dictated that Henry remain under Jasper Tudor's protection. A baby in a widow's arms could be taken, kidnapped, or killed by rivals. A baby in a fortress under the Earl of Pembroke's guardianship was far safer. For Margaret, this separation was both relief and torment. She loved her son desperately, but she knew she could not keep him close. He belonged already to history. Margaret's bond with Jasper deepened in those months. More than an in-law, he became her tutor in politics, teaching her how alliances were made and broken, how promises could be weapons sharper than swords. In dim chambers lit by guttering candles, he taught her to listen to what men did not say, to see how ambition could be cloaked in piety or friendship. Margaret absorbed every lesson. If she could not wield a sword, she would wield knowledge. If she could not bear more sons, she would make her one son's claim unshakable. The Wars of the Roses raged on outside Pembroke's walls. Armies clashed, banners of red and white roses fluttered, and the crown itself wavered between Lancaster and York. Margaret, still a teenager, could do little but pray and plan. Yet even then she sensed her role. She would not be a queen or a general, but something rarer and perhaps more powerful. She would be a mother whose entire life bent toward the shaping of a king. The pain of her shattered body never left her, but neither did it define her. Instead, it became fuel. Every ache reminded her of what she had endured, and every prayer steeled her against what was to come. If she could survive childbirth at 13, she could survive anything. Margaret Beaufort emerged from her near death, experience not diminished, but transformed. She had looked into the abyss and returned with iron in her soul. And though her body would never again know the pangs of childbirth, her spirit had given birth to something far greater, a relentless will that would stop at nothing to see her son upon England's throne. By 1458, Margaret Beaufort was barely 15 years old. She had endured what no child should, bringing forth a son in agony, surviving her husband's sudden death, and navigating the treacherous politics of a kingdom splitting in two. But widowhood was not a condition that society tolerated for long, especially in one so young. To remain unwed would leave her exposed, vulnerable to predators both political and personal. A new marriage was not a choice, it was necessity. Her second husband was Sir Henry Stafford, younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. Their union could not have been more different from the fevered gamble of her first. Where Edmund Tudor had represented Lancaster's fragile hopes, Stafford embodied security and pragmatism. He was neither the heir to vast titles nor a threat to Yorkist power, but he carried enough status to protect Margaret and her estates. The match was practical, a business arrangement forged in the shadow of civil war. The wedding itself was subdued, absent of the grandeur that had marked her union to Edmund. Margaret was still frail from her ordeal, her health delicate, her spirit shaped by grief and prayer. To many who looked upon her, she seemed more nun than bride. Stafford was no romantic suitor. He was older, cautious, and deeply aware of the shifting currents of politics. He leaned toward the Yorkist faction, while Margaret, through her Beaufort blood, was Lancastrian by default. Yet together, they crafted an understanding. Survival came first. Their marriage contract reflected this reality with extraordinary detail. Margaret retained her Beaufort estates, ensuring that her son Henry's inheritance remained untouched. Stafford, in turn, provided the protection of his family name and the military shield of the Buckingham retainers. It was less a union of hearts than of shields raised against a hostile world. For Margaret, there was little affection in this arrangement, but there was safety. After years of trauma, she now had a husband who would not press her body to produce heirs too soon, for he already had nephews and cousins to continue his line. Stafford's loyalty was not to passion, but to pragmatism. That suited Margaret. Her body was ruined. She would never again know the dangers of childbirth. Her life's mission narrowed to one thing only: the survival and advancement of her son. In those years, Margaret began to practice the art of invisibility. She learned to speak little, to pray much, to let the world see her as a quiet, pious, noble woman, unthreatening and harmless. It was a mask. Beneath it, her mind sharpened with every passing year. She studied scripture, law, estate management, and history. She managed her lands with meticulous care, building wealth and networks that would serve her son when the time came. She wrote letters, careful and cautious, cultivating relationships with nobles on both sides of the conflict. Her marriage to Stafford also gave her respite from immediate danger. With the Duke of Buckingham's family behind her, she was less vulnerable to Yorkist suspicion. Edward IV's rise to power in 1461, following the bloody victory at Towton, was devastating for Lancaster, but Margaret endured. Many Lancastrians fled, were executed, or lost their lands. Margaret, shielded by Stafford's cautious Yorkist leanings, survived intact, yet survival did not mean peace. Her son Henry, barely more than a toddler, remained in Wales under Jasper, Tudor's care. Margaret saw him rarely, sometimes only once or twice a year. Each parting tore at her heart, yet she accepted it with grim resolve. Henry was safer in Wales, far from the gaze of Yorkist kings who might see him as a threat. Still, she wrote to him, sent him small tokens, books, clothing, and rosaries, to remind him of the mother who prayed for him ceaselessly. In her prayers, she whispered not only for his safety, but for the day when his destiny would reveal itself. Stafford, though cautious, could not remain untouched by war. In 1469, he fought for Edward IV at Edgecote Moor, where he was gravely wounded. Margaret nursed him through long months of recovery, tending to him with patience, yet even as she cared for him, her mind was restless. The years of her second marriage taught her much: how to balance opposing loyalties, how to move carefully between York and Lancaster without losing ground, how to survive in a world where fortunes shifted with the tide of battle. She was becoming something more than a noblewoman bound to her husband's fortunes. She was becoming a strategist in her own right, a woman who understood that patience was as much a weapon as sword or lance. Margaret Beaufort was learning how to survive in silence, how to watch and wait. The Wars of the Roses raged on, yet she endured, her faith unbroken, her ambition hidden, her son growing in distant Wales. She was not yet ready to act, but she was already preparing. For Margaret, every day of survival was a step closer to the moment when her son might claim what she believed God had destined for him. The 1460s were years when England itself seemed to be tearing apart, and Margaret Beaufort stood at the margins, watching carefully, always calculating. She was still young, barely into her 20s, but the quiet years of her marriage to Henry Stafford coincided with the bloodiest struggles of the Wars of the Roses. The war had begun as a quarrel of succession, but it had become something more savage, a generational feud that pitted cousin against cousin, household against household, even father against son. The White Rose of York claimed legitimacy through the male line of Edward III's second son, Lionel of Antwerp. The Red Rose of Lancaster held the crown through John of Gaunt, Edward III's fourth son. It was a question of genealogy sharpened into battle lines, and by the early 1460s, the sword was deciding what parchment could not. In March 1461, the Battle of Towton was fought in Yorkshire, on a Palm Sunday made ghastly by snow and slaughter. Chroniclers claimed nearly 50,000 men fought there, and that half of them did not walk away. It was the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The snow turned red, corpses froze where they fell, and streams ran thick with blood. When it was over, the Lancastrian cause lay in ruins, and Edward, Duke of York, claimed the crown as Edward IV. For Margaret, Towton was more than just a distant tragedy. It was the moment that transformed her son Henry into a dangerous liability. As Edward IV solidified his reign, he could not ignore that a child existed in Wales, Henry Tudor, whose blood tied him directly to Lancaster. A boy, weak and unthreatening perhaps, but one who could someday be raised as a banner against York. The thought haunted Margaret, as surely as it haunted the Yorkist court. Jasper Tudor, steadfast in his duty, kept Henry close at Pembroke. But, Even that sanctuary was fragile. Edward IV had already shown a ruthless streak. His enemies were executed without mercy, their heirs dispossessed. Would he extend his policy to a child who might one day grow into an enemy? Margaret lived with that fear as a constant companion. Every letter, every rumor of soldiers moving in Wales set her heart racing with dread. Her marriage to Henry Stafford afforded her some protection. Stafford was cautious, leaning toward Yorkist sympathies. His allegiance kept suspicion from falling too heavily upon his wife. In the shifting allegiances of the time, this was no small feat. Lancastrians were being hunted, their estates confiscated, their titles stripped. Margaret, outwardly pious and harmless, slipped through the cracks. But inside, her heart burned. With a single thought, Henry must live. The rhythm of her life in these years was marked by absence. Henry was raised in Wales, and Margaret saw him only rarely. Letters were exchanged when possible, though messages were coded, carried by trusted servants or merchants, hidden in the folds of harmless accounts. She sent gifts when she could, small books of prayer, clothing, tokens of her presence. But mostly she lived with silence, wondering whether each sunrise would bring news that he was gone. At the same time, she trained herself in the arts of estate management and quiet diplomacy. She learned to balance accounts, to oversee farmlands and tenants, to calculate revenues and expenditures with the eye of a merchant. But she also cultivated allies. She wrote careful letters to noblewomen of both factions, weaving a web of connections that could prove invaluable later. She presented herself always as devout, obedient, and unthreatening, a mask that hid a watchful mind. The Wars of the Roses were merciless in their unpredictability. Kings rose and fell with dizzying speed. Henry VI, weak and half-mad, was restored briefly in 1470, only to be toppled again in 1471. Each shift in power brought peril for those tied by blood to Lancaster. For Margaret, it was a lesson in patience. She could not control the battles raging across England, but she could endure. Towton had shown her the cost of open defiance. The rivers of Yorkshire had carried away the bodies of thousands, their bones left to bleach in the fields. Margaret knew her strength would never lie in open confrontation. She could not wield a sword, nor lead an army. But she could endure, and she could plan. She could become the silent center of a storm, waiting for the moment when her son might return as England's answer to its endless war. For now, her role was survival. She bent her head in prayer, managed her estates, nursed her husband when he was wounded, and lived as though she had no ambitions. But within her, the fire never dimmed. The world was unraveling, yet Margaret Beaufort was weaving, stitch by stitch, the fabric of a future dynasty. The year 1471 carved a wound into Margaret Beaufort's heart that would never heal. The battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury destroyed the Lancastrian cause in a matter of weeks. Richard Neville, the kingmaker himself, fell at Barnet, his broken body left on the field. At Tewkesbury, the last hope of Lancaster bled into the soil. Edward of Westminster, the teenage son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, was struck down. Some said in the chaos of battle. Others whispered he was butchered. After capture, whatever the truth, his death ended the direct Lancastrian line. 2 weeks later, Henry VI himself died in the Tower of London. The official word was melancholy, a polite fiction. Few doubted the order had come from Edward IV's court. In one stroke, Lancaster had been annihilated. Except for one boy, Margaret's son, Henry Tudor, only 14 years old, suddenly became the last viable heir of the Lancastrian cause. His claim was distant, his bloodline tainted by whispers of illegitimacy through the Beaufort line. But none of that mattered. He was all that was left, and that made him valuable and very, very vulnerable. Jasper Tudor understood the peril. To remain in Wales was to invite capture and death. Edward IV's men were scouring the countryside, hunting down every remnant of Lancastrian resistance. If Henry was taken, his life would end quietly in a dungeon, the last flicker of Lancaster extinguished. The only chance was flight. On a storm-lashed night in September 1471, Jasper gathered Henry and a small band of loyal men and rode to Tenby on the Welsh coast. There they secured passage on a ship bound for Brittany. The sea was wild, the wind furious, and the boy they carried aboard was seasick and trembling, but he was alive. As dawn broke over the waves, Henry Tudor began 14 long years of exile. Margaret was not there to see him go. She was in England, unaware until days later that her son had fled across the Channel. When the news reached her, the grief was crushing. She had endured 14 years of distance already, seeing her son only in brief, precious visits under Jasper's protection. Now, he was beyond reach, a fugitive in a foreign land, his safety dependent on the whims of foreign dukes and the mercy of fate. She imagined him often, thin, pale, seasick on the crossing, clutching at the ship's rail while the waves battered him. Did he look back toward Wales? Did he wonder if he would ever see his mother again? She would never know. What she did know was that her life's purpose had narrowed even further. She was no longer merely the mother of a noble child. She was the mother of a pretender, the only surviving torchbearer of Lancaster. From that day, Margaret's heart became steel. She buried her grief in silence and sharpened her ambition. If Henry's exile was the cost of survival, then she would pay it. She would endure the years without him, endure the loneliness, endure the suspicion that hung over her as a Beaufort. She would wait, and she would plot. For Henry, exile was a crucible. In Brittany, he learned languages, manners, and the delicate balance of diplomacy. He was no longer just a boy. He was a pawn in the great game of kings, sometimes courted, sometimes threatened, always watched. But for Margaret, exile was agony. She prayed daily for his safety, bribed merchants and clerks for news, and began weaving the web of informants that would become her greatest weapon. At Tewkesbury, the red rose had been trampled into the mud, but Margaret Beaufort refused to believe it was dead. Her son still lived across the sea waiting, and she, widow, mother, survivor, would spend every breath ensuring that one day he returned, not as a fugitive, but as a king. In the aftermath of 1471, Margaret Beaufort faced a choice that would determine not only her own survival, but the very survival of her son's claim. With Henry in exile, and Lancaster seemingly destroyed, she might have chosen obscurity, a quiet life with a minor nobleman, hidden from suspicion, her days spent in prayer and estate management. But Margaret was not made for obscurity. Her mind was already bent toward a destiny larger than herself, and so she chose again, not safety, but power. Her second husband, Henry Stafford, lingered in poor health after his wounding at Edgecote. When he died later in 1471, Margaret was widowed once more at the age of 28. Twice a widow, once a mother, and still young, she was considered one of the most valuable marriage prospects in England. She could have married for protection. Instead, she married for advantage. Her third husband was Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, one of the most politically shrewd men in the kingdom. The Stanleys were masters of survival, northern magnates who had perfected the art of backing the winning side, at just the right moment. They had shifted allegiance between Lancaster and York more than once, but always managed to emerge unscathed, wealth and influence intact. Stanley himself was cautious to the point of cunning, a man who rarely revealed his hand until the outcome was clear. To some, he was a turncoat, to others, a master strategist. To Margaret, he was exactly what she needed: protection, intelligence networks, and military resources. For Stanley, Margaret offered something equally valuable: the Beaufort bloodline and the whispered promise of her son in exile. Their wedding in 1472 was no small affair. It was deliberately elaborate, a statement to the court that Margaret was not fading into obscurity. Guests feasted for days, jousts were held, and Edward IV himself attended. To the king, it was better to keep a dangerous woman like Margaret Beaufort married to a loyal subject under his watchful eye than to leave her free to conspire in shadows. But the marriage was not one of love. Margaret and Stanley both understood it as a partnership of mutual advantage. He provided her the shield of his influence, the ability to move safely in court circles, and access to his wide-reaching web of informants. She provided him with prestige, a claim to kinship with the Plantagenet line, and perhaps, though neither would say it openly, the possibility that one day her son might wear the crown. Behind the pageantry of their wedding, Margaret made certain her independence was protected. The marriage contract was precise. She retained control of her Beaufort estates, and she kept the right to direct her son's interests. It was an unusual arrangement, one that spoke of her determination never, again, to be merely a pawn. She had played that role as a child bride. Now she was a woman who would write her own script. As Lady Stanley, Margaret gained new power. She moved in court with greater freedom, listening, watching, weaving threads of influence. Stanley's household was large, his retainers many, his reach stretching into every shire of the north. Margaret tapped into this network, quietly gathering intelligence about Yorkist policies, troop movements, and whispers of dissent. Her quiet piety, her reputation for devotion, made her seem harmless. But behind her prayer books and rosaries, she was building the foundation of a resistance. Edward IV's reign seemed secure. He had crushed Lancaster at Tewkesbury, eliminated rivals, and ruled with vigor. But Margaret knew better than to trust appearances. She had seen too many kings fall, too many fortunes reversed. Power in England was never secure, and patience was often the greatest weapon. At home, she continued her habit of careful study. She read law and scripture, pored over chronicles of past reigns, and grew into one of the most learned women of her time. Her faith deepened, but so too did her political acumen. She understood that God's work was not done only in chapels, but also in council chambers, and that providence required human hands to guide it. And always, her thoughts returned to Henry. Across the sea in Brittany, he was growing from boy to young man, his life a fragile balance between patronage and peril. Margaret dreamed of him not as a fugitive, but as a king. Every alliance she made, every whisper she gathered, every prayer she uttered was bent toward that end. By marrying Thomas Stanley, Margaret Beaufort had chosen her shield, but she had also chosen her sword. With his resources at her back, she began to plan not just for survival, but for return. For the day when her son, Henry Tudor, would come back from exile, not as a hunted fugitive, but as England's deliverer. While Margaret Beaufort cultivated alliances in England, her son was growing into manhood across the Channel. Henry Tudor spent his exile under the uncertain protection of Duke Francis II of Brittany. To the Duke, the boy was both a potential bargaining chip and a dangerous guest. If the Yorkist kings pressed too hard, Henry might be handed over. If the French dangled promises, he might be deployed as a counterweight in their endless rivalry with England. For 14 long years, Henry's life balanced on the knife edge of diplomacy. Margaret, separated from him by sea and suspicion, did what she could. Letters passed between mother and son, though never directly. They were disguised, carried, by merchants or clerks, written in careful codes. Sometimes the message was hidden in a book's margins, sometimes in the folds of a trade invoice. Margaret used pseudonyms, aliases that made their correspondence seem mundane. A mention of apples might mean men. Harvest might mean troops. Even in exile, Henry was never truly alone. His mother's voice reached him in fragments of ink. For Margaret, each letter was agony and relief intertwined. She read and reread Henry's words, searching them for signs of health, strength, and resolve. She sent back tokens of devotion, rosaries, devotional texts, and reminders of his English heritage. These were not simply the gifts of a mother to a son. They were talismans, meant to bind him to the destiny she believed God had chosen for him. In England, Margaret wove a web of informants to monitor her son's safety. Merchants returning from Brittany reported on his condition. Pilgrims carried whispered news. Clerks passed along rumors from court. It was an intelligence network as sophisticated as any statesman's, remarkable in an age when women were expected to remain silent. Margaret heard of plots against her son before they reached fruition. She learned when Edward IV petitioned for his surrender, and when Brittany or France toyed with the idea of betrayal. The not knowing, the constant fear that one day her son would vanish into a Yorkist dungeon, gnawed at her. But her network kept her hope alive. Meanwhile, Henry himself was learning the harsh lessons of exile. Under Jasper Tudor's watchful, He was educated not only in noble accomplishments but in survival. He learned to ride, to wield a sword, to speak Welsh and French fluently. He watched the delicate negotiations of Duke Francis's court, where alliances shifted like tides, and he grew wary, cautious, deliberate. Exile forged in him a patience that would mirror his mother's own. Back in England, Margaret's life, with Thomas Stanley, offered cover for her quiet plotting. Her pious image made her appear harmless, her days spent in chapels, her nights in scripture. But beneath the surface, she cultivated connections on both sides of the dynastic divide. She exchanged letters with Elizabeth Woodville, Edward IV's queen, while maintaining secret sympathy with the exiled Margaret of Anjou. It was a dangerous balancing act. A single letter falling into the wrong hands could have ended her life. Yet Margaret managed it with remarkable skill. Edward IV's reign continued, strong but uneasy. The specter of Henry Tudor lingered at the edges of politics, never fully banished, always a possible rallying point for the discontented. To many, he was an exile of little consequence. To Margaret, he was the axis around which her entire life revolved. Night after night she prayed for him, kneeling until her knees bled, whispering petitions to God to preserve her son. And in those prayers, her private grief transmuted into unbreakable will. She was not merely waiting for Henry's return, she was preparing for it. Every alliance she forged, every rumor she gathered, every act of survival she performed was part of the same design: to one day place the exiled boy in Brittany on the throne of England. For now, she remained patient. But the kingdom was about to be thrown into chaos once more, and with it Margaret would find her moment to move. April 1483. King Edward IV, still in the prime of his power, died suddenly at the age of 40. His death shocked the kingdom. Though known for his excesses in food, wine, and women, few expected him to be struck down so soon. He left behind a boy of 12, Edward IV, who was to be crowned under the guidance of his mother Elizabeth Woodville and her ambitious Woodville kin. For a moment the Yorkist succession seemed secure, but within weeks it dissolved into suspicion, fear, and betrayal. The boy king never reached his coronation. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, brother to the dead king, intercepted the royal party as they traveled toward London. With polite words but armed force, Richard placed Edward V in the Tower of London, officially for his safety until the coronation. His younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, soon joined him. The people of London grew uneasy. Rumors spread like wildfire. Were the boys prisoners or guests? By summer, the truth had grown impossible to ignore. Richard declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, their children illegitimate. In July 1483, he crowned himself Richard III. The rightful king and his brother remained locked in the tower. Then, silence. The boys were seen less and less, then not at all. Whispers rose that they had been smothered in their beds, buried in secret beneath the stones. Though the fate of the princes in the tower remains one of history's enduring mysteries, to Margaret Beaufort, and to many of her contemporaries, the suspicion was clear. Richard had murdered his nephews. For Margaret, Richard's usurpation was both a danger and an opening. Richard III was no distant figure of dynastic legitimacy. He was a man tainted by suspicion, his crown stained with the blood of children. In seizing the throne, he had fractured Yorkist loyalty and cast a shadow over his own claim. For the first time, Margaret saw a path for her son. She began to plot, with audacity that bordered on madness. Through the shrewd and exiled Bishop John Morton and a network of sympathizers, she reached out to disaffected Yorkists. To Elizabeth Woodville, mother of the vanished princes, Margaret offered a startling alliance. Her son Henry Tudor, in exile, would marry Elizabeth's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. Such a union would unite the Red Rose of Lancaster with the White Rose of York, healing the Civil War through matrimony. It was a brilliant gamble. For Yorkists disillusioned with Richard, Henry Tudor became more than a Lancastrian exile. He became the only figure who could unite the warring houses. For Lancastrians, he was already their sole surviving hope. With one stroke of marriage diplomacy, Margaret had transformed her son from fugitive to potential savior of England. But conspiracy was perilous. In October 1483, a rebellion known as Buckingham's Rising was launched, coordinated with Margaret's secret efforts. Henry was to land in England with French support, while discontented nobles rose against Richard. But the rebellion collapsed. The weather turned against Henry's fleet, his ships scattered in storms. On English soil, the Duke of Buckingham was captured and executed. Henry fled back to Brittany, barely escaping capture. The rising failed, but Margaret's role was not forgotten. Richard III acted swiftly. Margaret was accused of treason, her lands confiscated, and she was placed under house arrest. Only her marriage to Thomas Stanley, Richard's cautious but useful ally, saved her from execution. Richard needed Stanley too much to risk his wrath by killing his wife, and so Margaret, silenced but not broken, endured. Even in confinement, she continued to weave her web. Through servants, through coded letters, through whispers passed in chapels, she kept contact with her son. She watched, waited, and prayed, convinced more than ever that God had chosen Henry for England's crown. The disappearance of the princes had transformed the political landscape. Richard III, crowned king, ruled under a cloud of mistrust. Henry Tudor, once a forgotten exile, was now spoken of in whispers across England as a potential alternative. And Margaret Beaufort, confined in her own house yet untamed in spirit, was already shaping the destiny of both. For 2 years after Buckingham's failed rebellion, Margaret Beaufort lived under the watchful eye of Richard III's men. She was confined to her home, her estates under royal control, her voice officially silenced. Yet silence was never Margaret's true state. Even under house arrest, she plotted. Servants carried whispers for her, priests smuggled messages, and the web of informants she had spent years weaving continued to hum with secrets. If Richard believed confinement would break her, he gravely underestimated the will of the woman, who had nearly died in childbirth at 13 and survived. Across the Channel, Henry Tudor waited in Brittany, still little more than an exile. But Margaret, in her letters and schemes, kept him alive in England's imagination. She presented him not as a fugitive, but as God's chosen instrument, the man who would unite Lancaster and York. And she did more than whisper prayers. She forged alliances. Most daring of all, she continued her negotiations with Elizabeth Woodville, ensuring that if Henry returned, he would marry Elizabeth of York. It was not just a marriage contract, it was a strategy to heal 30 years of bloodshed. Richard's crown grew heavier with each year. The whispers of murdered princes never faded, and his reign was marked by suspicion and betrayal. Nobles who once supported him began to waver. Margaret knew that when the right moment came, the cracks in Richard's foundation would split wide. What she needed was not only her son's return, but the right timing and the right betrayal. That betrayal would come from within Richard's own circle, Thomas Stanley, Margaret's husband. Stanley was the master of hesitation, a man who never committed until the outcome was clear. For years he had served York, then Lancaster, then York again, always emerging unscathed. Richard trusted him enough to leave him in power, but never enough to fully rest easy. What Richard did not know was that Margaret had quietly bent her husband's loyalty, not with passion, but with reason. She whispered of destiny, of safety for their family, of Henry's promise of power should he prevail. Slowly, Stanley shifted, not openly, but in careful steps. In 1485, the long gamble came to its climax. Henry Tudor, with French support, sailed from Brittany and landed at Milford Haven, not far from the castle where he had been born. From there, he gathered supporters, men weary of Richard's reign and eager for change. Margaret, though she could not ride at his side, had already paved his path with years of intrigue. The two armies met on August 22, 1485, at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire. Richard came with greater numbers, the crown gleaming upon his helmet as he led his men into battle. Henry, less experienced, carried not weight of years, but the fervor of a cause. And in the middle, holding back their forces, stood the Stanleys, Thomas, and his brother William, watching, waiting, calculating. The battle raged in mud and blood. Richard fought with ferocity, charging directly toward Henry, determined to end the fight with his own sword. For a moment, it seemed he might succeed. Chronicles tell us he struck down Henry's standard-bearer, the dragon banner faltering in the chaos. Richard, the last Plantagenet king, fought like a man possessed, unwilling to surrender even as the tide turned, and then the Stanleys moved. At the decisive moment, William Stanley brought his men thundering into the melee, not for Richard but against him. Betrayal became the blade that ended Richard's reign. Surrounded, struck down, Richard III fell in the mud, crying out as legend claims, "Treason! Treason!" His crown, battered and bloodied, was found later in a thorn bush. Henry Tudor was lifted upon the field and hailed as King Henry VII. The dynasty born in Margaret's agony at Pembroke Castle, the child she had nearly died to bring forth, now wore the crown of England. For Margaret, though absent from the battlefield, Bosworth was the culmination of nearly 3 decades of endurance, prayer, and plotting. She had outlived husbands, kings, and dynasties. She had survived disgrace, exile, and suspicion. And now, through her unrelenting will, her son was king. The gamble had paid off. The Wars of the Roses were over. And Margaret Beaufort, once dismissed, as a child pawn in the games of men, had become the silent architect of England's future. When the mud of Bosworth had settled, and Richard III's body lay stripped and broken, Margaret Beaufort's long struggle reached its zenith. Her son was proclaimed Henry VII, first king of the Tudor dynasty. Yet while Henry wore the crown, it was Margaret who had carried its weight for decades. She had safeguarded his claim through prayer and plot, endured exile and loss, and maneuvered like a chess master in a game where queens were rarely allowed to move. Her triumph was not merely political, it was personal. For 30 years, she had lived in separation from Henry, sometimes not knowing whether he was alive or dead. Now in 1485 she stood beside him, no longer the mother of a fugitive, but the mother of a king. The cost of that reunion, however, was written across her life. A body broken by childbirth at 13, marriages endured for survival, and years of maternal love sacrificed to the demands of war. Margaret's influence at court was extraordinary. Unlike most queens' dowager or king's mothers, she was never content with ceremonial honors. She styled herself My Lady the King's Mother, a title that carried more weight than most could have imagined. Henry, cautious and calculating like his mother, relied on her deeply. She advised him on matters of law, finance, and diplomacy. She managed estates larger than many nobles. She corresponded with bishops, scholars, and foreign rulers, her piety lending authority to her words. In 1486, Margaret saw the crowning achievement of her political vision: the marriage of Henry VII to Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of Edward. Fulfie, the union of Lancaster and York, Red Rose and White Rose, healed a kingdom fractured by 3 decades of civil war. The Tudor rose, red and white entwined, became the symbol of unity. That vision had been Margaret's, born in whispers with Elizabeth Woodville years before. Now it was made flesh in the royal couple. As Henry's reign unfolded, Margaret continued to shape it quietly. She sponsored learning and founded colleges at Cambridge, leaving a legacy of scholarship as enduring as her dynasty. She cultivated an image of deep devotion, her days marked by fasting, prayer, and charity. But beneath the veil of piety remained the steel that had carried her through a lifetime of peril. She was not only the king's mother, she was his anchor, the living memory of all that had been risked to place him on the throne. In 1509, as Henry VII lay dying, Margaret was there, steady and prayerful. He passed before her, but not before securing the succession of her grandson, Henry VIII, the boy who would become one of the most infamous monarchs in English history. Margaret lived long enough to see the coronation of this second Henry, ensuring that her dynasty was not a fragile flame, but a blazing torch that would burn for generations. Only then did she herself slip away, dying just days after Henry VIII's crowning. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey remains one of quiet dignity, a black, marble slab inscribed with Latin that praises her piety and learning. Visitors who pause before it see the serene face of a woman carved in stone. But what they do not hear are the echoes of her life. The cry of a girl in agony at Pembroke, the whisper of coded letters carried across seas, the prayers whispered in dark chapels, and the shouts on the field of Bosworth where her destiny was sealed. Margaret Beaufort's life was one of sacrifice, endurance, and relentless will. She was never queen, but she gave England kings. She was never warrior, but she won a dynasty through patience sharper than any sword. She had entered the world as a pawn, child bride, widowed girl, pious widow, but she left it as a queen mother in all but name, the silent architect of the Tudor age. Her story reminds us that history is not only shaped by those who wear crowns, but by those who bear them for others. Margaret bore hers in blood, prayer, and iron resolve. And though centuries have passed, the dynasty she birthed in suffering still looms large over England's memory. She was the foundress of a dynasty, one forged not in triumph alone but in pain, sacrifice, and a mother's unyielding devotion.